What do you do when you're standing in a hotel hallway with roses, ready to surprise your wife, and a barefoot stranger opens the door instead? Then you hear her voice call him babe, like you're the one who wandered into the wrong life? My name is Ethan Rowe, and for most of my life I believed I was the kind of man who could solve problems by showing up early, staying calm, and doing the small things other people forgot. I believed that if you loved someone steadily, and if you carried your share without complaint, then life would eventually reward that steadiness with peace. That belief was why I stood in a hotel hallway on a Thursday evening, holding a bouquet of roses like a prop in a romantic movie, convinced I was about to surprise my wife and reset whatever had been off between us lately. It was a clean hotel, the kind that tried to smell like citrus and money, and the carpet under my shoes had that soft, deadened feel that made every footstep sound like you were walking inside a secret. The lighting was warm, the walls were beige, and the air conditioning pushed a low, constant hum that reminded me of a distant engine. I remember noticing the small details because my mind was trying to make the moment ordinary, and ordinary moments are made from details. The roses were red and too perfect, and I had bought them from a florist near my office because I wanted the gesture to be simple and unmistakable. No grand speech, no dramatic apology, just a quiet sign that I still cared and that I was still willing to meet her halfway. My wife's name was Lila, and she had always said she didn't need gifts, but she had also always smiled when I brought them anyway, because smiles are not about need. They are about being seen. She had told me she was at a work conference, and I had nodded the way husbands do when they hear the word conference, because that word carries a soft authority. It implies schedules and name tags and professional development, and it implies that you should not ask too many questions. She had shown me a printed agenda on our kitchen counter, and she had pointed at a time slot with her fingertip like she was showing me a map. It all looked reasonable, and I had wanted to believe it because believing your spouse is easier than interrogating your own marriage. The hotel was not far from downtown, and the conference name on the agenda matched the hotel logo, so my plan felt almost responsible. I would arrive a little after dinner, knock softly, hand her the roses, and maybe offer to take her to a late dessert place that stayed open for travelers. I imagined her surprised laugh, the little eye roll she did when she was pleased, and the quick kiss that said, without words, that we were still us. I found her floor, walked past a vending machine that blinked like a tired arcade, and followed the numbers on the doors until I reached the one she had written on a sticky note for me earlier that week. She had given it to me like a casual detail, the way you mention a parking spot or a gate number, and she had said it might help in case I needed to reach her. I had taken it without suspicion, because suspicion is what you feel when something is already broken, and I had not yet admitted that our marriage had cracks running through it. I stopped outside the door and adjusted my grip on the flowers because I did not want to crush the petals. My heart was doing a small, hopeful sprint, and I remember thinking that it was ridiculous to feel nervous around someone you had been married to for 8 years, and yet I felt nervous anyway. The hallway was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing, and the silence had a polite, unnatural quality, like the building itself was holding its tongue. I knocked once, not too loud, not too soft, and I waited for the familiar rhythm of her footsteps and the slide of the chain lock. Instead, there was a pause that felt longer than it should have, followed by the sound of movement that did not match her pace. The door opened halfway, and a man stood there barefoot, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and a look of mild annoyance, as if I was a delivery problem he had not ordered. He was not young enough to be a college kid, and he was not old enough to be somebody's uncle at a family reunion. He was in that confident middle range where men either have their life together or pretend they do, and the difference between those two categories can be hard to spot at a glance. His hair was damp, like he had showered recently, and he had a hotel towel draped over his shoulder like he belonged there. For a second, my brain refused to translate what I was seeing. My mind tried to file him under acceptable explanations, like wrong door, wrong floor, wrong hotel, because the alternative was a sharp, immediate kind of pain that would change everything. I looked at the number on the door again, even though it was the same number I had been staring at for 10 seconds. The man's eyes moved to the roses, and his expression shifted, not into confusion, but into something close to recognition, like he understood the shape of the situation before he understood who I was. He did not look surprised to see a husband holding flowers. He looked like he had seen that type of scene before, and he knew what usually came next. I opened my mouth to speak, and I honestly do not remember what I planned to say, because my thoughts scattered like birds. Before I could form a sentence, I heard Lila's voice from inside the room, light and familiar, carrying the kind of casual intimacy that only exists when you assume you are safe. "Babe," she called, not loud, not nervous, not careful, just easy. That single word did something inside me that I can only describe as a temperature change. It was as if my blood went from warm to cold in one smooth motion, and the coldness did not shock me as much as it steadied me. People talk about rage, and they talk about heartbreak. But what I felt first was a quiet, clinical clarity, like my brain had finally accepted the truth it had been avoiding. The man's face tightened, and he glanced over his shoulder toward the room, as if he was calculating whether to close the door or to step out. He did neither, which told me something about his personality, and possibly about how often he had been allowed to stand in this kind of doorway without consequences. In the space of a few seconds, I noticed more details than I wanted to notice. I saw a second pair of shoes on the floor behind him, not women's shoes, but men's shoes, placed neatly like someone cared about appearances. I saw a suit jacket draped over the back of a chair that I could glimpse through the gap, and the jacket looked expensive in a way that did not fit the barefoot t-shirt routine. I saw a room service tray near the bed, and there were 2 glasses on it, not one, and the ice had melted down into a clear puddle. My mouth went dry, and the roses felt heavier in my hand, as if the stems had turned into metal. I wanted to step back, because stepping back would create distance, and distance would give me time, and time would allow me to pretend I had not heard that word. But my feet did not move, and I realized I was holding still because I needed to witness the moment completely, as if my mind needed the full evidence to accept that it was not a misunderstanding. The man finally spoke, and his voice was low, cautious, and falsely polite, the way people speak when they want to control a situation without looking guilty. He asked who I was, but he did it in a tone that suggested he already knew, and he was simply confirming. I told him my name because my name felt like the only solid thing left. I told him that I was looking for my wife, and I watched his eyes flicker again, because in his mind, she was not a wife, she was a story he had been told, and now, the story had walked into the hallway with flowers. Inside the room I heard movement, quick and uneven, and then Lila appeared in the gap behind him. Her hair was loose, her cheeks were flushed, and she was wearing a hotel robe tied too tightly, as if tightness could replace dignity. The moment she saw me, her face did something I had never seen before, and I do not mean shock, because shock is too clean. Her expression was a collision of fear, calculation, embarrassment, and anger all layered together. For a heartbeat, she stared at the roses like they were an accusation, and then her eyes snapped up to mine. She tried to speak, and nothing came out, which was the closest thing to honesty she had given me in months. I wanted to ask her why, but the question was too large to fit in the hallway. I wanted to demand an explanation, but explanations are usually designed to make the liar feel better, not to make the betrayed feel whole. I realized that if I spoke in that moment, I would either beg or explode, and I did not want to be either kind of man. So I stood there and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them. The man shifted his weight, and Lila's hand tightened on the robe belt, and I watched them both like I was watching a demonstration of something I had studied, because the alternative was to collapse. Finally, Lila managed to say my name, and she said it as if it was a problem she needed to solve, not a person she had hurt. She took one step forward, and I noticed her eyes flick to the end of the hallway, maybe searching for witnesses, because public shame was clearly on her mind even now. I felt a sharp, bitter amusement at that, because she had brought a stranger into a hotel room but still feared a neighbor seeing her. I asked her one simple question, because simple questions are harder to twist. I asked her if this was the conference, and I watched her flinch as if the word had been slapped across her face. The man tried to interrupt, but Lila lifted her hand slightly, a small command gesture, and he stopped immediately. That told me more than I needed to know about how this arrangement worked. She began to speak in fragments, and every fragment sounded like it had been rehearsed. She said it was not what it looked like, which is the oldest lie in the world, and she said she could explain, which is what people say when they are buying time to build a better lie. She said I was overreacting, and hearing that phrase in that moment felt almost insulting in its laziness, as if she thought my reality could be managed with a slogan. I looked at the roses again, and I felt something in me settle into place, like a lock turning. The coldness returned, not as numbness, but as focus. I realized I did not need to argue with her, and I did not need to convince her of anything, because the truth did not require her agreement. I set the roses down on the carpet, right there between my shoes and the threshold of that room, because I wanted the gesture to die where it belonged. I did it slowly, carefully, as if I was placing something fragile on the ground, and in a way I was, because I was placing the last piece of my old marriage down, like an offering no one deserved. Then I looked at Lila and told her that I would not beg for my own dignity. I told her that I would not shout in a hallway like a man who had lost control of his life, because losing control is exactly what cheaters count on. I told her that she could stay in that room and keep pretending, but she would not be pretending with me anymore. Her face shifted again, and this time the fear looked real, because she understood that I was not going to play the usual game. She took another step forward, and I could see her mind racing through options, through excuses, through bargaining chips, through threats. I saw the version of her that I had ignored for too long, the version that treated people like situations. I turned away before she could touch me, because touch would have made it emotional, and emotion would have made it messy. As I walked down the hallway, the carpet swallowed the sound of my steps, and the silence felt like a witness. I did not run, and I did not look back, because looking back would have been permission for them to rewrite the scene. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and when I stepped inside, I saw my reflection in the mirrored panel, and I barely recognized the man staring back. His face looked calm, but his eyes looked like someone had turned a light off behind them. On the ride down, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and I did not check it, because I already knew it would be her, and I already knew the pattern. First would come panic, then anger, then blame, then a performance of regret, all designed to pull me back into the role of the forgiving husband who absorbs pain quietly. Outside the hotel, the air was colder than I expected, and the streetlights made the pavement shine like wet stone. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel without turning the key. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like my body was trying to contain something too large. I thought about all the small moments of the last few months, the late nights, the sudden privacy around her phone, the way she would tilt the screen away when I entered a room. I thought about how easy it had been to excuse it, because the alternative was admitting that my life was built on someone else's lies. I did not cry, and I did not pray, and I did not make vows to myself in dramatic language. Instead, I did the first thing a careful man does when something breaks. I started organizing the pieces in my mind, not for revenge in the movie sense, but for truth in the practical sense. Because if Lila could stand in a hotel room and call another man babe, then she could also lie to our friends, and to our families, and to anyone who would listen. She could make me the villain for reacting, and she could paint herself as a misunderstood wife trapped in a cold marriage. I knew that story, because I had heard versions of it in other people's divorces, whispered at parties like entertainment. I sat there for a long time, listening to the faint tick of the cooling engine, and I understood something I had never understood before. Love is not what ends a marriage. Not always. Sometimes what ends a marriage is the moment you realize the other person has been living in a separate reality and you have been funding it with your trust. When I finally started the car, I did not drive home right away. I drove aimlessly through the city, letting the streets blur because I needed my mind to stop replaying the hallway. But the hallway stayed sharp and bright, and the word babe echoed like a stain that would not wash out. By the time I turned toward home, my shock had hardened into intention. I did not know the full shape of what was coming, and I did not know how far she had gone, or how long it had been happening, or who else knew. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty, and it was the kind of certainty that makes a man dangerous in a quiet way. I was done being surprised. I did not sleep that night, and not because I was pacing or drinking or doing anything dramatic that would look good in a story, but because my brain refused to stop sorting the last few months into two piles, what I had believed and what I had ignored. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doorway again, the man's bare feet on the carpet, the casual way he owned the space, and the sound of my wife's voice using a word she had not used for me in a long time. The scene replayed with different angles, like my mind was trying to find the version where I misunderstood, but there was no version like that. When Lila finally came home, it was almost dawn, and she entered our house the way people enter a courtroom, careful and already defensive. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my phone face down, because I did not want to see her name flashing up like a demand, and because I wanted her to understand that I had stopped chasing her. The light above the stove was on, and everything else was dim, and the house felt smaller than it had yesterday, like the walls had leaned in to listen. She froze when she saw me, and I watched her do the quick internal math of whether to cry first or argue first. Her hair was still damp, but she had tried to style it, and her makeup had been repaired with that rushed, uneven hand that says someone was panicking in a mirror. She smelled like hotel soap layered over perfume, and the combination made my stomach tighten because it was too specific, too intimate, like a fingerprint. She started talking immediately, and the words tumbled out fast, as if speed could replace truth. She said I scared her by showing up, and she said it was not fair to ambush her like that, and she said the man in the room was just a colleague who had too much to drink and needed a place to crash. She said she tried to explain in the hallway, but I walked away, and she said I humiliated her by doing that, as if her embarrassment was the main injury in the situation. I listened without interrupting, because interruption would have turned it into a fight, and I did not want a fight. Not yet. I wanted to hear the shape of her lie, because lies have patterns, and patterns can be tested. I watched her hands while she spoke, because hands tell the truth, even when mouths do not, and her fingers kept tightening and releasing like she was gripping an invisible rope. When she finally paused, she looked at me like she was waiting for me to collapse into apology for catching her. There was a time when I would have done that, not because I was weak, but because I was invested in keeping our life stable, and stability can become a quiet addiction. That night in the hotel hallway had killed that addiction. I asked her to repeat one detail, calmly, because calmness makes people careless. I asked her what his last name was, since he was a colleague, and I asked what department he worked in, since they were close enough to share a room. Her eyes flicked toward the fridge, then toward the window, then back to me, and she gave me a name that landed too slowly, like she was building it while she spoke. I nodded as if I accepted it, and I watched relief try to rise in her face. That relief irritated me more than anger would have, because it showed she thought this was still a game she could manage. She took a step closer, and she reached for my hand, and I pulled my hand back without flinching, the way you avoid touching a hot pan. Then she changed tactics, because she is good at tactics, and she always has been. She said our marriage had been distant, and she said I had been emotionally unavailable, and she said she had felt lonely for a long time. She said the hotel was a mistake, and she said she did not know how it happened, and she said she was sorry, but she said it in a tone that suggested the apology was something she deserved credit for, not something I deserved to receive. I stood up and started making coffee, because the domestic normality of it felt almost sarcastic, and because I needed my hands to do something steady while my mind worked. I could feel her watching me, waiting for a sign that I was softening, but I did not soften. When the coffee began to drip, the sound was loud in the silence, like a countdown. I told her I was going to ask her one more thing, and I told her to answer carefully. I asked her whether she had called him babe, because I wanted to see if she would deny the one thing I was certain about. Her face tightened, and she said I must have misheard, and she said she had called out to a friend on the phone, and she said the hallway echoed and it distorted sound. That was the moment I understood something with painful clarity. She was not trying to explain what happened. She was trying to edit what I had witnessed. She was not asking how badly she hurt me. She was measuring how much she could get away with. And the hardest part was realizing that she was doing it with the same voice she used when she asked me to pick up groceries, the same voice she used when she thanked me for fixing the sink, the same voice she used when she wanted a favor. I walked to the living room and sat again, and I placed my phone on the table between us, still face down, like a marker on a map. Her gaze followed it, and I saw a flicker of something that looked like fear, because she knows what phones hold, and she knows what careless people leave behind. I told her to sit, and she sat, but the way she sat was tense, perched, as if she might bolt. I said I had not come home to scream or to beg, and I said I had come home to understand the truth before she had time to shape it. I said there was no version of this where I forgot what I saw, and I said there was no version where her embarrassment mattered more than my reality. My voice stayed even because evenness is a weapon when someone expects chaos. She tried to interrupt, and I raised one finger not aggressively but decisively, and it worked. That surprised her, and I could tell it surprised her because she is used to steering conversations by momentum. I told her that earlier, after I left the hotel, I checked my voicemail, not because I expected anything important, but because I wanted to know what she had tried to say in the minutes after I walked away. I told her that she had left a voicemail, and I told her I listened to it twice. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, and she asked what voicemail, like she could erase it by pretending it did not exist. I did not answer that question directly, because I did not want to give her control of the pacing. Instead, I turned the phone over and unlocked it, slowly enough that she could see I was not shaking. I found the voicemail and I did not play it yet. I let her stare at the screen, and I let the silence stretch until it became heavy. She said she did not know what she said, and she said she was upset, and she said whatever it was, it did not mean anything. Then she leaned forward and tried to reach for the phone, and I slid it back toward me without drama, the way you move a glass away from the edge of a table. The small gesture landed hard because it told her I was not negotiating. I asked her again, in a quieter voice, if she wanted to tell me the truth before I played it. That was her last clean exit, and she knew it, because her throat moved as if she was swallowing something sharp. She looked at the doorway, as if escape was an option, and then she looked back at me with a brittle expression that tried to be offended. She said I was being controlling, and she said it was creepy that I was holding on to messages like evidence, and she said normal couples do not do that. Her tone tried to turn me into the villain, and I almost admired the reflex because it was fast and practiced. But then she added something that gave her away, a small slip that would have been invisible to anyone who wanted to believe her. She said I always did this, meaning I always collected details, and she said I always kept notes, and she said I always waited to use them at the worst moment. I had never kept notes in our marriage, not once, but the fact she believed I did told me she had been performing for me for a long time, watching for signs of scrutiny. That realization felt like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. I looked at her and told her she was not going to reframe this. I told her I was not going to argue about my reaction while she avoided my question. I told her I saw what I saw and I heard what I heard, and I was done letting her decide what reality I was allowed to live in. My voice stayed controlled, but I could feel the coldness deepen, turning into something sharp enough to cut. Then I tapped the screen and played the voicemail. The room filled with her own voice, and it sounded different coming from a speaker, stripped of facial expressions and body language, leaving only meaning. It started with her breathing fast, and then her tone shifted into something I recognized immediately, because it was the tone she used when she spoke to people she thought were beneath her attention. She was not talking to me in that message. She was talking about me. I watched her face as her words unfolded, and I watched the exact second she realized what she had done. Her eyes widened, then her skin went pale, and she opened her mouth like she was about to snatch the sound out of the air. But she could not, because sound does not reverse, and truth does not crawl back into hiding once it has been spoken. When the voicemail ended, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequences. Lila stared at the phone like it was a grenade, and then she looked at me, and for the first time that night, she did not have a line ready. Her lips moved, but no words came out, and her hands trembled slightly on her knees, and I knew that whatever she had accidentally left on that message had just stripped away her strongest weapon. Because now, I did not just have a scene from a hallway. I had her own voice, preserved, undeniable, saying the part she never meant me to hear. Lila did not rush at me again, because the voicemail had changed the physics of the room, and even she could feel it. A minute earlier, she had been building a case about my behavior, about my tone, about my so-called ambush, and now she was trapped inside her own words, not the ones she had rehearsed for me, but the ones she had left behind when she thought the only audience was herself and whoever she was calling back. I watched her carefully, because people do not confess when they feel safe, and they do not confess when they feel powerful, but they sometimes confess when they feel cornered and their best tools fail. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, and her eyes kept returning to the phone as if she could bargain with it. She started to speak, then stopped, then tried again, and each attempt died in her throat like a match struck against wet paper. When she finally produced sound, it was not apology, it was strategy, wrapped in a trembling voice to make it look like emotion. She said she was upset. She said she did not mean what she said. She said she had been venting, and she tried to reduce the message to a mood. Then she shifted, as if she remembered she could not erase the content, and she tried to reduce the content to context. She said I had been distant, and she said I had made her feel alone, and she implied that loneliness could be used as a receipt for betrayal. I let her speak, because the more she explained, the more she revealed what she believed she could justify, and that belief mattered. She was not horrified by what she had done, not in the way a person is horrified when they realize they have hurt someone they love. She was horrified that she had left evidence. That distinction would have crushed me if I were still begging for the marriage to be salvageable, but the begging part of me had gone quiet in that hotel hallway, and the part that remained was colder and more attentive. I asked her to tell me one simple thing, and I asked it with the same calm tone I would use to ask about dinner plans because calm makes lies look foolish. I asked her how long it had been going on, and I asked her without raising my voice, because raising my voice would give her something to hide behind. She looked at me like the question was unfair, like time was a detail she should not be forced to provide, and then she said it was recent, and she said it was complicated, and she said she had been confused. Recent was a word people use when they want to minimize damage, and complicated was a word people use when they want to avoid specifics, and confused was a word people use when they want to shift responsibility into the fog. I nodded once, as if I accepted those words, and I watched relief creep into her face again, because she thought I was taking the bait. Then I did something that made the relief drain away. I told her I did not need a dramatic confession tonight. I told her I needed quiet, and I needed space, and I needed the house to stop being a stage for her rehearsals. I told her she could sleep in the guest room, and I said it the way you assign a seat on a plane, not the way you ask a spouse for cooperation. She reacted the way she always reacted when she felt control slipping, with offended outrage disguised as dignity, and she said I could not make decisions for both of us. I did not argue, because arguing would have been the old pattern, the one where we spin until one of us tires out, and she usually wins because she is better at turning emotion into pressure. I simply repeated that I needed quiet, and I told her that if she wanted to keep talking, she could do it with a lawyer later. The word lawyer did not frighten her the way it should have, and that told me another truth, one that settled into me like sediment. She had thought about this ending before I did. She went to the guest room eventually, not because she agreed, but because she could not push further without looking desperate. I stayed at the table long after she disappeared down the hall, listening to the house breathe around me, listening for footsteps, listening for doors, listening for the small movements people make when they are pretending to sleep. I did not move because I did not trust myself to move without doing something impulsive, and impulsive was the one gift I refused to hand her. When the first light began to lift the edges of the curtains, I stood and walked through the kitchen slowly, noticing small things that I had not noticed before, because before I was living inside a story where she was my wife and the rest of the world could not touch us. There was a receipt on the counter from a pharmacy run, folded and smudged, the kind of ordinary paper that never means anything until it does. There was a new charger brick plugged into the wall that I did not recognize. There was a faint scent of hotel soap clinging to her scarf where it hung on the hook by the door. None of it proved anything on its own, but together it made a picture of how much she had been moving through spaces I was not allowed to see. I took my phone and opened a blank note. Then I stopped, because I could hear her voice from the voicemail, accusing me of keeping notes like evidence, and I almost laughed at the irony. Then I wrote anyway, because the moment she realized I was not emotional enough to be manipulated, she would pivot to making me look unstable. People like Lila do not lose clean. They rewrite the loss so they can still win the audience. I wrote the date and time, and I wrote the hotel name from the key card sleeve I still had in my pocket, and I wrote the fact that a barefoot man opened the door, and I wrote the exact sentence I had heard, because memory is loyal until stress forces it to lie. I added a line about the voicemail, and I saved the audio to a separate folder with a name so bland it could pass as nothing. I was not hacking anything, and I was not stalking anyone, and I was not doing anything illegal or cinematic. I was doing the boring part, the part where you stop trusting vibes and start trusting records. Then I did something that surprised even me. I opened our shared calendar, not to spy, not to dig through messages, but to look at the patterns we had built together, the public version of our life. Lila had always insisted on keeping schedules tidy, because tidy schedules look like tidy people, and tidy people are believed. I scrolled back over the last few weeks, and I noticed how often she had blocked time for errands that were vague enough to mean nothing and long enough to hide anything. There was a repeating entry that caught my attention, a midweek slot labeled with a word that could cover half the world: planning. I tapped it and saw no location, no details, just time carved out like a private room. I felt the first thread pull taut in my hands, not because a calendar entry was scandalous, but because of how carefully empty it was. A soft sound behind me made my spine tighten. I turned and saw her in the hallway, barefoot now, wrapped in one of my old hoodies, like she was trying to borrow innocence. She looked exhausted, but there was calculation under the exhaustion. She asked if we could talk again, and she said she had not slept, and she tried to make sleeplessness feel like shared suffering. I told her we could talk later, and I kept my voice neutral, because neutrality forces people to reveal their intent. She stepped closer and asked what I was doing on my phone, and her tone was casual, almost playful, but her eyes were sharp. I told her I was checking the calendar, and I watched her body stiffen in a way she could not fully hide. It was not a dramatic reaction, just a small tension in the shoulders, a tiny pause before she spoke again, and that pause was louder than shouting. She said the calendar was messy lately, and she said she needed to clean it up, and she offered to take my phone so she could fix it. The offer was too fast, too eager, and it hit me with a clean understanding. She was not afraid of what I knew from the hallway, because she could call it a misunderstanding, but she was afraid of what I might find in the ordinary places she had stopped thinking about. I told her no, and I said it with a calm that made her blink. I told her I liked it messy for now, and I told her I needed to see things as they were. She tried to smile, and the smile looked like it had been glued on. Then she changed direction again and asked if I wanted breakfast, as if eggs could reset reality. I watched her walk back toward the kitchen, and I noticed something else that tightened the thread. Her phone was in her hand, and her thumb moved across the screen quickly. Then she tilted the phone away from me, shielding it with her body. It was a small gesture, one she might not even notice she was doing, but it was the gesture of a person who has something to protect. I did not demand her phone, and I did not accuse her, and I did not chase her into a corner because I was starting to understand that my best leverage was not confrontation. My best leverage was patience and the quiet, relentless accumulation of small truths. I let her make breakfast, and I let her act like a normal wife in a normal morning, and I let the performance play out, because performances fall apart when the audience stops applauding. While she cooked, I added another line to my notes. She reacted to the shared calendar. She tried to take the phone. She shielded her screen. None of it was proof of cheating on its own, but it was proof of fear, and fear points toward what people value most. I could feel the plan forming, not as revenge, not as rage, but as a simple, practical route out of confusion. If she wanted to rewrite what happened in that hotel hallway, I would stop giving her empty space to write in. I would fill the space with dates, times, and receipts, with ordinary facts that do not bend when someone cries. And when the time came, I would not need to shout. I would only need to press play again. By the third day after the hotel hallway, the house had learned a new rhythm because Lila had turned every ordinary moment into a test, and I had stopped taking the tests. She moved through the rooms like a person trying to prove she belonged there, fixing small things that did not need fixing, wiping counters that were already clean, and asking questions that sounded innocent until you listened to the timing, because she always asked them when my phone was on the table or when my attention drifted toward the calendar. She wanted me distracted, she wanted me softened, and she wanted the story to become one of mutual misunderstanding instead of documented betrayal. I kept the calm face she hated, not because I was some stoic hero, but because I could feel what she was building in the background, and I refused to hand her the missing ingredient. The old me would have demanded explanations and chased her into the corners of her own logic, and that would have given her the exact footage she needed: the angry husband, the unstable man, the one who scares her, the one who forces her to make difficult choices. The new me was quieter, and that quiet made her nervous, because it left her without a villain to point at. That afternoon she said she had a planning meeting again, and she said it with the same casual tone she used for grocery runs, but her eyes checked my reaction before she checked her keys. She kissed my cheek like a courtesy, took her bag, and left, and I did not ask who the meeting was with or where it was, because questions were a currency now, and I was saving mine for the moment they would cost her something. The door clicked shut, and the house went still, and I stood at the kitchen counter for a long minute, staring at a small smear of lipstick on the rim of a mug that had been rinsed, but not truly cleaned, as if even her mistakes were trying to be subtle. I did not follow her because I did not need to chase what was already running toward consequences. Instead, I opened the shared calendar again and looked at the entry she had labeled with that bland word, and I compared it to the rest of the week, to the other blocks of time she had claimed as errands, and I noticed the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Every planning entry sat near another entry that belonged to me, an appointment, a shift, a meeting, something that would keep me anchored and predictable, which meant she had been scheduling her freedom around my reliability. I wrote the date and time down, then I set my phone aside and did something even more boring than a calendar check, because boring is where people get sloppy. I opened the drawer where we kept paper, and I sorted through the stack of receipts we never organized, the ones from pharmacies and hardware stores and grocery trips, and I stapled them in order, because disorder was her camouflage. Most of them were normal, the kind of purchases any household makes, but the farther back I went, the more I found the small tells that appear when a person tries to live two lives on one budget. There was a receipt from a hotel cafe, not a room charge, just a cafe purchase with a time printed on it that made no sense with her supposed schedule. There was a parking garage ticket stub folded into a jacket pocket, and the garage name was not near any place she had mentioned that week. There was a florist charge that was not connected to any birthday or holiday, and the total was high enough to be memorable, and yet she had never mentioned it, which meant the flowers were not meant for me, and they were not meant to be seen. I felt something tighten in my chest, not because flowers are proof of sex, but because they are proof of intention. People can trip into mistakes, but people do not trip into roses and secrecy, and I knew that because I had been the man in the hallway holding roses, convinced I was about to surprise my wife. The irony did not make me laugh anymore, because it was no longer darkly funny, it was simply clean and ugly, and it had forced me to see what I had been refusing to see for years. When Lila came home later, she was a little too bright, a little too energetic, and she spoke too quickly about traffic, about a problem with parking, about how exhausting it had been to deal with everyone's needs. The words were normal, but the delivery was wrong, and I watched the way she set her bag down, the way her phone never left her palm, the way she moved through the kitchen without taking her coat off, as if she was ready to leave again at any second. Her nervous system was still in the meeting, wherever that meeting truly was, and it was trying to outrun the evidence that might already exist. I asked her one small question, the kind of question that should have been effortless if her story was true, and I asked it without accusation, so she could not claim I was attacking her. I asked her what the name of the place was where they met, because sometimes details are the only trap you need. She hesitated, then said a place name that sounded plausible, and then she added a second place name, as if she needed backup, as if a single location might not cover the time gap. I nodded and said nothing else, and I watched her relief try to rise again, because she thought she had gotten away with it. After dinner, she went to the bathroom and stayed there longer than usual, and I heard the faint sound of her water running, not because she was washing her hands, but because she was trying to create noise, and noise is a kind of privacy. When she finally came out, she had her phone in her hand again, and she held it close to her chest like a wallet, and she sat on the couch beside me with a careful distance, close enough for appearances, far enough to keep her body between me and the screen. I did not ask for her phone, and I did not mention the receipts, and I did not mention the calendar, because I could see how badly she wanted me to show my cards. Instead, I asked her about the hotel, and I said the word softly, like a simple label, not a weapon. Her whole body stiffened in a way she could not disguise, and then she tried to laugh, the brittle laugh of a person who thinks laughter can erase a picture. She said it was not what it looked like, and she said I had shown up at a bad moment, and she said she had been helping a friend, and she said a dozen other things that all collapsed under one simple fact. A barefoot man opened the door, and she called him babe. The room filled with silence again, But it was not the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of calculation. She watched my face as if she was searching for a crack, and I watched her hands as if they were a separate person, because hands tell the truth before mouths do. Her fingers tapped her phone screen twice, then paused, then tapped again, and I understood what she was doing without needing to see it, because I had already heard the voicemail, and I knew she would try to clean the trail the moment she felt pressure. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, not to storm away, but to create distance, because distance turns performances into discomfort. I pulled the stapled stack of receipts from the drawer and set them on the counter, and I placed the hotel cafe receipt on top like a bookmark. I did not slam it down, and I did not speak loudly, and I did not call her names, because the point was not to hurt her. The point was to stop her from pretending. I asked her to look at the time on the receipt, and I asked her to tell me how that time fit with the place name she had just given me. She came into the kitchen slowly, as if walking toward the counter might burn her, and she stared at the paper as if paper was unfair. She said the cafe receipt could have been from anyone, and she said it did not prove anything, and she was right in the narrow sense that one receipt is not a full story. But then she said something that told me more than the receipt ever could, because she said I was being obsessive, and she said I was turning small things into accusations, and she said I was scaring her with how calm I was, scaring her, because calm meant I was not manageable. I told her I was not asking her to confess tonight, and I told her I was asking her to stop lying to my face while she erased her tracks behind my back. I told her we could handle this like adults, with separation terms and clear boundaries, and I told her that if she wanted to keep the marriage, then she had to stop treating it like a stage where she could rewrite everything after the scene ends. She looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment I saw the version of her I had always avoided naming, the version that does not feel guilt until consequences become real. She said she needed air, and she reached for her coat, and she moved toward the door too quickly, and I felt the old instinct to stop her rise up, the instinct to block and plead and demand. I let the instinct pass without feeding it, because I realized something sharp and simple as she grabbed her keys. She was not going out for air. She was going out to warn him. The door opened, the cold night rushed in, and before it closed behind her, her phone lit up in her hand with a preview notification that flashed across the screen for half a second, long enough for me to read a name I did not recognize and two words that did not belong to a planning meeting. My pulse did not race, because the shock was gone now, but something else moved through me, something colder and more certain, because the trail was no longer abstract. Someone was watching my wife run. And now I had a name to put on the next page of my ledger. The name on that lock screen preview stayed in my head like a grain of sand you cannot stop feeling, because it was small and ordinary and still somehow sharper than the barefoot man in the doorway. And once you have a name, you can stop arguing about theories and start building a timeline that does not care about feelings. I did not chase her into the night, and I did not call her 10 times like a desperate person trying to be heard, because desperation would only feed the story she wanted to tell later, the story where I became unstable and she became the exhausted woman forced to protect herself. I stood at the kitchen counter with the stapled receipts. I took a slow breath that felt like swallowing glass, and I made a choice that was both petty and necessary, because when someone is rewriting your life, you either become an editor or you become a character. I picked up my phone and opened the Notes app. Then I wrote the name exactly as I saw it, with the same spelling, because people lie, but spelling usually does not. I added the date and the exact time the preview flashed, because time is the only witness that never forgets. And I wrote down the 2 words that had been visible beneath the name, the 2 words that did not belong to errands or planning meetings. It was not a full message, it was not a confession, and it was not enough to take to anyone as a single piece of proof, but it was enough to tie a knot in the rope. I labeled the note with a plain title, something boring that would not look dramatic if she ever saw it, And then I set the phone down again and listened to the house, because the house sounds different when you realize you have been living inside someone else's performance. After 10 minutes, I walked through the room slowly, not searching like a burglar, not tearing through drawers like a jealous teenager, but doing the kind of inventory that married people pretend they never do, because shared life creates shared clutter, and shared clutter creates shared mistakes. Her coat was gone, her keys were gone, and her favorite scarf was gone, which meant this was not a quick drive around the block to cool off. This was a planned exit. On the entryway table, the little bowl where we dumped everything was missing one of the spare key rings, and I stared at that empty space longer than I should have, because spare keys have a simple purpose, and that purpose is not air. I went back to the kitchen and opened the shared calendar again, but I did it with a different mindset this time, because I was no longer looking for a single lie, I was looking for repetition. When you place a life on a grid, you start seeing the same shapes appear, and those shapes do not happen by accident. I found the pattern that had been forming around my own commitments, the way her planning blocks hugged the edges of my predictable hours, and I noticed how often those blocks sat near a hotel district on the map in my mind, near the places where conference traffic and lobby bars make people feel invisible. I did not need to track her, and I did not need to follow her car, because I could see her habits in the negative spaces, the gaps between what she claimed and what was possible. Then I did something I would have laughed at a week ago, because it felt like a man's attempt to regain dignity through paperwork. But dignity is often made of paperwork when feelings have been weaponized. I pulled out a clean sheet of printer paper and drew a simple table by hand, because a hand-drawn table is harder to erase than a memory, and I began listing dates, times, claimed reasons, and what I could verify from our own household records. I wrote in pen, not because it mattered legally, but because it mattered psychologically, because pen forces you to commit, and committing to reality is the first thing betrayal tries to steal. Her absence stretched into an hour, then into 2, and I felt the old reflex to imagine scenarios, to picture her laughing, to picture her apologizing, to picture her crying, to picture her doing anything that would let my mind settle on a story. I refused to pick a story until I had facts, because facts do not soothe you, but they do stabilize you. When she finally came back, it was not with the messy energy of someone who had just taken a walk. It was with the controlled calm of someone who had completed a task. She stepped inside softly. She shut the door without a slam, and she stood there for a beat, as if listening to the air, as if checking whether I had moved from the position she expected me to be in. She walked into the kitchen and looked at the paper on the counter, because the paper was visible and boring, and therefore threatening, and her eyes flicked to my phone as if she could feel what I had written down. She asked what I was doing in that careful tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while they calculate their next line, and I told her I was making sense of the week, because I needed to know what was real. She tried to smile, and the smile did not reach her eyes, because she could sense that my questions were no longer emotional, they were procedural. She said I was overreacting again, and she said it as if repeating the phrase enough times could make it true, and something in me did go cold, not because the words were new, but because she was still trying to shrink the facts until they fit inside her comfort. I did not raise my voice, and I did not lean toward her, and I did not demand her phone, because I was done playing the role of the jealous man who needs access to feel safe. Instead, I moved my phone to the center of the table and left it there, screen up, because if she wanted to accuse me of staging something, I wanted the stage to be clean and obvious. I opened my call log and my voicemail list, and I scrolled until I found the one that mattered. The voicemail she had left by accident when she thought she had ended a call. The voicemail where her tone changed in a way it never changed with me. I did not play it immediately, because I wanted her to understand what she was about to hear before she heard it, and I wanted her to have one last chance to tell the truth without being pushed. She tried to wave it off with that same tired patience, like I was a child insisting the monster under the bed was real, and she said I was twisting things again. Then I pressed play. The sound that came out of my phone was not loud, but it filled the kitchen anyway, because voices have a way of taking over a space when they carry intimacy. Her voice on that recording was soft in a way she had not been soft with me in months, and it carried the kind of casual affection people use when they think no one is watching. It was not a full conversation, and it did not include names spoken clearly, but it included enough little endearments, a reference to the room, a comment about timing, and a laugh that did not belong to an argument about errands. It was the sound of my marriage being treated like an afterthought, while she built a different version of herself in a different doorway. Lila's face changed in stages, because denial is not one expression, it is a sequence. First came the blank look, then the quick blink, then the tightening at the jaw, then the attempt to look offended, and finally the sudden stillness of someone who realizes there is no angle left that will make this look innocent. She reached for the phone, not to hear more, but to stop it, and I kept my hand on the table near the device without grabbing it, because I did not need a struggle. I needed the moment to stay clean. The voicemail ended on its own, and the silence afterward was so heavy it felt physical. She started talking fast, explaining, reframing, trying to move the conversation into the muddy water where everything becomes interpretation, because interpretation is her shelter. She said the hotel hallway was a misunderstanding, and she said the man was a friend of a friend, and she said she had been helping someone with a problem, and she said the word babe was not what I thought, and I watched her build a tower of sentences the way a child stacks blocks right before it collapses. I did not interrupt her, because people reveal more when they think they are winning time. I waited until she hit the point where she tried to make the lie sound like an insult to me, the point where she implied I was paranoid, and then I finally spoke with a calm that surprised even me. I told her that the problem was not the hotel or the voicemail by itself, and the problem was not even the sex, because sex was only one symptom of something uglier. I told her the problem was the pattern, the coordinated calendar blocks, the unexplained receipts, the spare key ring missing from the bowl, the new name flashing on her screen, and the way her first response to being caught was not remorse, but strategy. I told her that if she wanted to keep pretending, she could do it without me participating, because I was no longer available to be edited. For the first time that night, she looked afraid in a real way, because she realized I was not asking for reassurance anymore. I was stating boundaries. She asked what I wanted, and her voice finally dropped into something closer to honest, because fear strips away performance when it gets strong enough. I told her I wanted the truth in a form that could not be denied later, the truth written down, dates and places included, because I was done living inside vague apologies. I told her that if she refused, I would assume the worst version of the timeline, and I would act accordingly, because she had already taught me that her words were flexible. She stared at the receipts again, then at the paper table I had drawn, and I saw her calculating, trying to decide whether a partial confession would buy her time, trying to decide whether the name I had seen was worth admitting to, trying to decide whether she could still protect whoever she had been warning earlier. Then her phone buzzed on the counter beside her bag, and she flinched so hard it looked like pain, because even her body knew the truth before she could shape it into a story. The screen lit up just enough for me to catch it again, the same name, another preview, and this time I saw a single word that told me everything about her priorities, because it was not about safety or fear or regret, it was about control. I did not reach for her phone, and I did not need to, because the reaction was the evidence, and I understood in that moment that the next 30 days were going to be a slow, lawful demolition, built on small, undeniable truths. And while she stood there deciding what lie to pick, I quietly picked up my own phone and took one photo of my evidence table, the receipts, and the voicemail screen, because if she tried to rewrite tonight later, I wanted tonight to exist outside her mouth, and as the camera clicked, I realized the name on that lock screen was not just a lover's name anymore. It was a key, and I finally knew which door to open next. By Monday morning, the house felt staged, as if every object had been placed there to convince me the weekend never happened, and that quiet order was the closest thing to a threat I had ever seen in my own kitchen. I did not sleep much, not because I was pacing or crying into my hands, but because my mind kept replaying the same sequence with new angles, and every angle ended at the same conclusion, which was that she had prepared for this long before I showed up with roses like a fool. I went through my day the way you go through a building after a fire, stepping carefully around what used to be normal and noticing the damage without touching it, because touching it is how you get cut. At work, I kept my voice steady, I kept my schedule intact, and I refused to act like a man who had been publicly humiliated, because humiliation feeds on visibility, and I was not giving anyone that kind of meal. Still, the world has its own cruel timing, and the first crack appeared before lunch when my phone buzzed with a merchant alert from my own account, a small notification for a charge that looked ordinary at first, until I read the merchant name twice and felt my jaw lock without permission. It was a boutique hotel chain, not the one from the hallway, but close enough to the same world, and the amount was not huge, which was almost worse, because it suggested routine rather than one reckless mistake. I did not call her, and I did not text her, because a reactive message would only warn her that her paper trail was visible, and I wanted her to keep walking in the direction she had already chosen. Instead, I opened the notification, took a clean screenshot, and saved it into a folder I labeled with a boring name that would not spark curiosity if she ever glanced at my phone, because the best hiding place in a shared life is a place that looks like chores. I wrote the date and time under it. Then I added one line to my hand-drawn table at home as soon as I returned, because the physical act of writing grounded me in a way digital notes never could. When you write down betrayal, it stops floating like a nightmare, and it becomes a timeline, and timelines can be tested. That evening, she moved around the house with the careful confidence of someone who thinks the danger has passed, and she acted almost sweet in that polished way she uses when she wants to reset the tone without addressing the cause. She asked about my day. She offered to heat up leftovers. She said a few casual things about errands, and none of it matched the tension in her shoulders when her phone lit up, because her body had become a second witness that did not know how to lie. I watched her while pretending to watch the television, and I noticed how she angled the screen away from me with a movement so practiced it looked like habit rather than fear. And that was the moment I accepted something I had resisted all weekend, which was that the hotel hallway was not an exception. It was simply the first time her hidden life collided with my physical presence. Later, when she went to shower, I did not creep through drawers, and I did not search her bag like a desperate man hunting for proof, because that kind of search would only turn me into the villain in her future story. I stayed in the living room, and I checked our shared calendar the way you check weather before a storm, not looking for drama, but looking for contradictions that could not survive daylight. The blocks were there again, the same vague labels, the same convenient placement around my hours, and now that I had seen one merchant alert and heard one voicemail, those blocks stopped looking like harmless planning and started looking like scaffolding. I exported the week view as a simple file, saved it, and printed it the next morning at work like it was a routine document, because nothing draws attention like printing the wrong kind of paper at the wrong time. 2 days later, the first pressure wave hit, and it did not come from her, which is how you know it is real. I was waiting for coffee when a coworker I barely spoke to smiled too warmly and asked how my wife was doing, and the way he said it made the question feel like a probe rather than kindness. I answered politely. I kept my face neutral, and I left without asking why he asked, because you never give gossip the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. Still, my stomach tightened as I walked back to my desk, because I understood the game she was playing in the background, which was to seed a version of me into the social soil before I could plant the truth. If she could make me look unstable, then every fact I produced later would be reframed as obsession, and I had seen enough of her techniques to know she loved that kind of framing. That night, she tried a new angle, the tired one where she pretends the conflict is exhausting her, and therefore my continued attention to it is cruelty. She said she was stressed, she said she felt watched, she said she wanted us to move forward, and she said all of it without once acknowledging the barefoot man, which was like watching someone step around broken glass and insist the floor is fine. I listened, I nodded once, and I told her I was willing to move forward only after we agreed on what had happened, in clear language, with dates, because moving forward without truth is just moving deeper into a lie. Her eyes narrowed, and in that narrow look, I saw the same cold intelligence that had been on the voicemail, the intelligence that measures people like obstacles. The next morning, a second clue arrived by accident, and accidents are how most real cases are solved, because guilty people get lazy around the small details. She left her phone on the counter while she went to the garage, and the screen lit up with a lock screen preview that lasted maybe 3 seconds. But those seconds were enough, because the preview included a location tag that made my throat go tight. It was not a full address, just the name of a lounge bar attached to a conference hotel, and the message underneath was a short line about tonight being easier if she used the side entrance. I did not touch her phone, and I did not need to, because I was not trying to steal anything. I was trying to document what life was already showing me. I raised my own phone like I was checking a notification. I took a quick photo of her lock screen from a respectful distance, and I put my phone back down before she returned, because I wanted the moment to remain clean, and I wanted my method to stay lawful and simple. That afternoon, I did something that felt both humiliating and empowering, because it was the kind of thing you do when you finally accept you are in a fight you did not choose. I went to my bank's website and pulled my own statement lines, focusing only on charges linked to me and my account, and I compared the dates to the calendar blocks she had created. The overlap was not perfect, because she was careful, but it was frequent enough to destroy coincidence. And when I saw 2 charges on nights she claimed she was at a committee meeting, my hands stopped shaking entirely, because certainty has a calming effect that hope never provides. I printed those statement lines, highlighted only the merchant and the date, and I placed them into a clear sleeve with a label, not because I was going to march into court tomorrow, but because I was building something she could not blow away with tone and tears. On Friday, she said she had a late volunteer planning session, and she said it with an easy smile that would have fooled me a month ago. Then she kissed my cheek like we were normal and walked out like she had nothing to fear. I waited 20 minutes after the door closed, not to follow her, not to track her, but to check something simple that any spouse can check without breaking a law or a boundary. I searched the volunteer group's public page, scrolled through their posted updates, and found a message from the coordinator announcing the session had been canceled due to a venue issue, which meant her cover story had collapsed without me doing anything at all. I took a screenshot of the post with the date visible, saved it, and wrote 1 sentence on my table at home, because 1 sentence is all it takes to turn a claim into a contradiction. When she came home late, she tried to sell the same story anyway, and the ease of her lie was almost impressive, because she did not even adjust it to account for the possibility that I could verify it. She complained about the venue, she joked about wasted time, and she acted annoyed in the way people do when they want you to stop asking questions. I let her finish, then I asked a single calm question about the name of the coordinator she spoke to, and she paused half a second too long before answering, which told me she was creating details on the spot. I did not correct her, and I did not confront her with the screenshot, because I was not collecting lies for sport. I was collecting them for timing. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the table with my sleeves of paper, my printed calendar, my merchant alert screenshot, and the photo of her lock screen, and I arranged them in order like a quiet ritual. I realized I was no longer waiting for her to come clean, because coming clean would never happen in a way that protected me, and I realized that whatever public stage this would end on, it would not be powered by anger. it would be powered by documentation. My phone sat beside the stack, and I stared at it for a long time, because I knew the next move was not to shout, and it was not to beg, and it was not to threaten, but to choose the moment when her social armor would matter most and then remove it with one verified fact. As I turned off the kitchen light, my screen lit up again with another alert, and it was a new charge tied to my account, small and stupid, like she assumed small things could never kill her story, and I understood with a strange, steady clarity that she was not just cheating. She was spending my reality like it was disposable, and I was done letting her decide what I was allowed to know. By the time Saturday arrived, my anger had cooled into something more useful, because anger wants to sprint, and sprints make noise. But patience moves like a shadow and leaves a paper trail behind it. I spent the morning doing normal things on purpose because normality is camouflage, and camouflage keeps your enemy lazy. I made coffee, I washed a few dishes, I answered a couple work emails, and I watched her watch me with that careful glance that always appears when a liar suspects the room has changed, but cannot prove it. She asked if we were okay, not as a real question, but as a test of how much I knew, and I answered with the same calm tone I use when I am closing a case at work, because the tone matters almost as much as the facts. She drifted back to her phone, and the house filled with the soft sounds of weekend life, yet it felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a glass wall. I waited until she stepped outside to take a call, then I opened my own phone and reviewed what I already had, because evidence is only powerful when it forms a clean sequence. I had the merchant alerts with dates and amounts. I had the exported shared calendar week view that showed her vague blocks. I had the public cancellation post that destroyed her volunteer session story, and I had the lock screen photo that hinted at a side entrance and a lounge bar attached to a conference hotel. Each item alone could be dismissed by someone skilled in denial, but together they created a pattern that a neutral person could understand within minutes. I added one more column to my handwritten ledger, not because it was necessary, but because structure keeps the mind from breaking, and I needed my mind steady for what came next. Around noon, she said she had to run an errand for supplies, and she made the statement casually, like someone describing buying milk, which was almost funny given how much her casual statements had started to cost. I did not ask where she was going, because questions warn people, and I did not offer to come, because offers warn them too, and instead I nodded and let her leave without resistance. The moment her car pulled away, I pulled up the bank statement lines again and cross-checked the merchants that had appeared this week, because I wanted to see which places repeated, and repetition is where routine hides. I noticed one small charge that I had ignored earlier, a parking garage entry receipt that looked like downtown, and I realized I had made a mistake by focusing only on the dramatic locations like hotels. Cheaters do not live in drama every day. They live in logistics, and logistics leave receipts. I drove to my office under the excuse of printing a document, which was true, even if the document was not the one I would tell anyone about. I printed a clean copy of the statement lines. I highlighted only the merchant names and dates, and I printed the shared calendar week view that showed her blocks, because paper forces reality to sit still. Then I did something I had avoided for days, which was to open my call log and scroll to the moment that started this chain, the moment I stood outside that hotel door with roses and a plan, and heard her voice call another man babe. I did not need to replay it for pain, because the pain was already stored in my body, but I needed it for timing, because timing turns memories into proof. I took a screenshot of the call log showing the time and duration, saved it into the same dull folder, and wrote the timestamp next to my ledger line like I was recording a traffic accident. When I returned home, she was already there, moving around the kitchen with bags that looked like errands, yet she avoided eye contact the way people avoid mirrors after doing something ugly. She said she had been busy, she said the store was crowded, and she said it all with the bright impatience of someone who wants to be believed without being questioned. I accepted the words without reaction, not because I believed them, but because I wanted her to keep the same pace and the same habits. The more comfortable she felt, the less careful she would become, and comfort is the true enemy of liars. I helped put away the groceries because involvement gives you a clearer view of what is staged and what is real, and I noticed she had purchased a brand of breath mints she never buys for our house. I did not confront her with that detail, because I was not collecting trivia, but I did add it to the back of my mind, because small changes often point to bigger routines. That evening, she suggested we go out for dinner, and the suggestion sounded generous, yet I could feel the strategy behind it, because a public dinner creates a story, and stories are the currency she trades in when she needs cover. I agreed to dinner, but I chose the location, and I chose a place close to the lounge bar named in her lock screen preview, because I wanted my own eyes to learn the neighborhood without following her anywhere. We ate, we talked about neutral topics, and she tried to pull me back into normality with jokes that landed like cold coins on a table, but I kept my attention on her phone habits and her rhythm. Twice during dinner, her screen lit up and she lowered it immediately, and each time her breath changed for a fraction of a second, as if she was adjusting to a new pressure she could not explain. After we came home, she went to shower, and I stayed in the living room with the television playing low, while I opened the public page of the conference hotel that sat near that lounge. I did not hack anything, and I did not sneak into private systems, because I do not need illegal shortcuts to expose someone who is already stepping on rakes. I found an upcoming event listing, a charity networking reception that was open to registrants, and the date matched one of the calendar blocks she had labeled as volunteer planning. The listing included a public RSVP link that showed partial attendee names, and I saw her first name there with her last initial, sitting beside a name that made my stomach go still, because it was the same first name that appeared on the voicemail, spoken by the barefoot man as if he belonged in her mouth. I took a screenshot of the RSVP list, saved it, and wrote one clean line on my ledger that made the whole week snap into place. When she returned from the shower, she looked lighter, almost relaxed, and she asked if I wanted to watch a movie, because she was trying to smooth the surface again. I said yes, because yes keeps you close enough to hear the lies when they slip. Halfway through the movie, her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her, and she grabbed it too quickly, which made her movement loud, even though she did not say a word. She claimed it was a friend checking in, and she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes, and I realized she was not just hiding an affair, she was managing a schedule like a project. That thought changed the shape of my fear, because projects usually have supervisors, and supervisors usually have leverage. The next day, Sunday, I met my sister for coffee, not because I wanted sympathy, but because I needed an external witness to see my face and confirm I still looked like myself. I did not tell her the whole story, and I did not smear my wife in a dramatic confession, because drama creates counter-drama, and counter-drama is where truth gets drowned. I asked my sister simple questions about how rumors move through our family, about who talks to who, and about which relatives always seem to know things first. She answered with that casual honesty family members have when they think it is just gossip strategy. And she mentioned our cousin who works event staffing downtown, the kind of job where you overhear people who assume staff are invisible. I noted the cousin's name and said nothing more, because I did not want anyone to contact anyone, and I did not want any friend favors, but I did want to know who might already have seen my wife in places she claimed she never visited. That afternoon, my phone pinged again with another small merchant alert, and this time, the charge was for valet service at the same conference hotel. The amount was low enough to seem harmless, but the location was loud enough to be a siren, and I felt that strange calm again, the calm that arrives when the puzzle finally stops resisting. I took the screenshot, placed it into my folder, and added the date and time to my ledger with a steady hand that surprised even me. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the RSVP screenshot, because the list did not just show her presence, it showed planning, and planning implied someone on the other end who expected her to be there. When she walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting there so still, her expression tightened, and she asked what I was doing, and her voice carried a light edge of annoyance that was meant to push me back into silence. I told her I was organizing paperwork, because that statement was true in the cleanest possible way, and I watched her react to the word paperwork as if it was a threat. She tried to recover with a laugh, then she changed the subject fast, and I realized she was afraid of documents more than arguments, because documents do not care how convincing you sound. That night, when she fell asleep, I did not touch her phone, and I did not search her accounts, and I did not need to, because her own life had already started confessing through the cracks. I laid out the printed calendar, the bank lines, the RSVP screenshot, and the call log time. Then I drew a straight line between them with a pen, like I was marking a route on a map. The line was simple, and that simplicity made it brutal, because it removed every romantic excuse she might later try to sell. I understood then that the next phase would not be private, because private is where liars negotiate, and I was not negotiating my dignity back from the person who sold it. I was going to pick a room full of witnesses, pick one verified fact, and let her own silence do the rest, and the only question left was which room she thought she controlled, because that would be the room where she fell the hardest. Monday arrived with the clean cruelty of routine, and I understood that routine was the only thing keeping her brave, because when life feels ordinary, even a liar starts believing her own script. She kissed my cheek before I left for work, and the kiss was staged, not affectionate, as if she was stamping a document that needed my signature. I returned the gesture with the same calm I had practiced in the mirror, because I did not want my face to confess what my mouth refused to say. The moment I got into my car, I did not drive straight to the office because I had learned that a plan needs quiet space, and quiet space is rare once the day begins. I parked in a lot 2 blocks away, pulled out my printed evidence stack, and reviewed it like a checklist, because the best way to avoid an impulsive confrontation is to treat the truth like inventory. My phone buzzed with a notification from our shared calendar, a polite reminder about a committee session scheduled for Wednesday evening, and I almost laughed at the audacity of it, because she had built her cover story into the calendar as if the calendar were a judge. I opened the week view, and I stared at the block, because it was the same time as the charity networking reception I had found online, and the overlap was so obvious that even a tired stranger could see it. I exported the week view again as a PDF, not because I lacked the previous copy, but because I wanted a clean version with the automatic date stamp, and I wanted that stamp to show Monday's date, so nobody could later claim I had manufactured it after the fact. I saved it into my folder, then wrote a line on my paper ledger with the date, the time, and the reason I was saving it, because I wanted the story to be readable without my emotions. At work, I moved through my tasks with a strange detachment, like my body was doing its job while my mind rehearsed a different scene entirely. I answered emails, I attended a short meeting, and I smiled at coworkers in the hall, because smiling is a mask that keeps you from looking like a man who is about to burn down his own marriage in public. During lunch, I stepped outside and called the number listed on the event page for the charity reception, not as a spy and not as a trick, but as a person requesting basic information any registrant could ask. A calm voice answered, and I asked a simple question about entry time and whether guests needed printed tickets, because I needed the logistics for my plan to remain lawful and clean. The coordinator confirmed the schedule and mentioned that badges would be handed out at a table near the ballroom doors, which told me there would be a controlled entry point, witnesses, and a predictable moment of attention. When I got home that evening, she was already there, perched on the couch with her laptop open, and she looked busy in the way people look when they want you to believe they have a life you are not allowed to question. She said she had a long day, she said she was exhausted, and she said it as if exhaustion could erase the math of timestamps. I asked her how the committee planning was going, and I kept my voice mild, because I wanted her to think I was still the same husband who swallowed discomfort. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she said the committee was stressed, that things were chaotic, and that she might need to stay late Wednesday to help finalize details. I nodded, because nodding costs nothing and buys you more lies, and I watched her eyes flicker when she said Wednesday, as if she could already see the hotel hallway in her mind. Later that night, while she was in the shower, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter with a preview notification, and I saw just enough without touching anything, because the universe likes to hand you proof when you stop begging for it. The preview showed a short line about meeting at the lobby bar before badge pickup, and it included a single letter that looked like a first initial, followed by a heart emoji. I did not need the full message, and I did not need to open the phone, because the preview itself was a lawful glance at what the screen displayed in my own home. I lifted my own phone, took a photo of the preview while it was still visible, and I made sure the kitchen clock was in the frame, because time is the spine of every story. When the screen went dark, I felt my pulse hammer for a moment, not from panic, but from certainty, and certainty is always heavier than doubt. The next morning, Tuesday, I woke early and went for a run, not because fitness mattered, but because I needed my nervous system to burn off the energy that might otherwise spill into my voice. When I returned, she was making coffee, wearing the same comfortable robe she always wore, and for a brief moment, the scene looked like a normal marriage again, which was the most dangerous illusion of all. She told me she had a meeting at lunch with someone from the committee, and she said it with a casual shrug, like she was discussing a dentist appointment. I asked which cafe, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before naming a place across town, and that hesitation was a small betrayal all by itself. I did not correct her, and I did not accuse her, because accusations are a gift to liars, and I was done giving gifts. During the day, another merchant alert arrived, and this one was for a small purchase at a florist, which would have been sweet in a different life, except the amount was not tied to any anniversary, any birthday, or any reason she had mentioned. I saved the alert, and I felt a cold amusement, because I had stood in a hotel hallway holding roses for her, and now the money trail suggested she might be buying flowers for someone else. The symmetry was almost insulting, as if the universe was mocking my original hope by repeating the symbol with different ownership. I printed the merchant alert at work, stapled it behind the others, and wrote one additional line on the ledger that said, in plain words, what the florist charge meant to me. That evening, she came home later than usual, and she carried herself with a kind of confidence that felt rehearsed, like she had practiced acting unbothered in the mirror of a restroom somewhere. She said the lunch meeting ran long, she said the committee needed her, and she said she was sorry, though the apology sounded like a formality rather than regret. I asked if she wanted dinner, and she said she had already eaten, which was another detail that would have passed unnoticed in a normal week. I watched her go to the bedroom, and I listened to her move around, and I could hear the faint sound of a drawer opening and closing, as if she was preparing something, as if she was packing a version of herself she planned to use outside our home. Wednesday arrived like a loaded coin flip, and the morning air felt thinner, as if my body knew the day would matter, even if I pretended it did not. She dressed carefully, more carefully than she did for work, and she chose perfume she rarely wore, which was the kind of quiet tell that makes a husband feel invisible and insulted at the same time. She told me again that she would be late, that the committee needed her, and she asked if I minded, not because she cared, but because she wanted to gauge my temperature. I told her I did not mind, and I kept my eyes steady, and I watched relief wash over her face, because she thought the storm was still far away. After she left, I did not pace the house or spiral into rage, because I had already crossed that bridge days ago, and what remained now was logistics. I packed a slim folder into my work bag, the kind of folder that could pass as ordinary paperwork, and I included only the cleanest proofs, because too much evidence looks like obsession, while the right evidence looks like inevitability. I brought the exported calendar PDF, the RSVP screenshot, the merchant alerts, and the photo of the lock screen preview with the kitchen clock in view. I also brought my call log screenshot showing the time of that hotel hallway moment because I wanted the timeline to begin with the first betrayal and end with the last lie. In the late afternoon, as the sky dimmed, I drove toward the event location, not with the frantic energy of a man chasing his wife, but with the steady focus of someone arriving to a meeting he had scheduled. I parked legally, walked in calmly, and approached the badge table like any other attendee, because that is what I was now, an attendee of my own marriage's collapse. The lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive air freshener, and people in business clothes drifted toward the ballroom doors with practiced smiles. I stood to the side and waited, because waiting is powerful when you know exactly what you are waiting for. Then I saw her, and she was laughing with a man whose posture said entitlement, the kind of man who never doubts that doors will open for him. He leaned in close, and she tilted her head toward him, and the intimacy was casual, effortless, practiced, which told me this was not a single mistake, but a habit she had nurtured. She did not see me at first, because she was looking at him the way she used to look at me, and that realization was a quiet kind of death. I felt my grip tighten on the folder and I forced my hand to relax, because this was not the moment for a scene, this was the moment for confirmation. At the badge table, a volunteer asked for her name, and she gave it confidently, and then she gave his name too, as if it belonged beside hers. The volunteer handed them badges, and I caught the printed letters as they turned, and I saw the same initial that had appeared in the lock screen preview. My stomach went cold, not from uncertainty, but from the finality of it, and I understood that the hotel hallway had not been the start. It had only been the first time I had been invited to witness it. I stepped back into the crowd, pulled out my phone, and took a single photo of their two badges together as they moved, because the badges were public, the moment was public, and I was done pretending my humiliation had to stay private. I did not confront them yet, because I needed the room to fill, I needed the witnesses to settle, and I needed her to believe she was safe long enough to make one more mistake. I walked toward the ballroom entrance and looked at the sign-in sheet on the stand, the kind of sheet that records attendance for anyone who cares later, and I watched a coordinator check names with a clipboard. I waited until the table was briefly unattended, then I photographed the top portion of the sheet where her name and time were visible, because I knew she would later claim she had never been there, and I wanted the record to disagree. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, took a slow breath, and turned toward the doors, because the next part of my plan did not require anger, only timing. Across the lobby, she glanced up, and for a split second her eyes met mine, and in that instant her face changed as if someone had cut the power to her confidence. She froze. The man beside her kept talking, and she forced a smile that looked painful, like she was trying to hold her mask in place with shaking hands. I did not wave, and I did not glare, because both gestures would give her something to perform against. I simply looked at her, calm and still, the way a judge looks at a witness who has already contradicted herself, and I saw fear bloom behind her eyes because she realized the story had just shifted and she did not know how far. I turned away before she could recover, because control is often just refusing to give someone a reaction, and I walked into the ballroom with my folder under my arm, blending into the crowd like a man attending a normal event. My heart was steady, my face was neutral, and my mind was painfully clear, because I had finally reached the point where truth does not feel like a weapon, it feels like gravity. Somewhere behind me, I heard the faint shuffle of hurried footsteps, and I knew she was coming, not to confess, but to manage me, and I almost admired the instinct, because it was the same instinct that had built this mess. I took my seat near the aisle, placed the folder on my lap, and waited for her to choose her next lie, because whatever she chose, I was ready to record it. By the time she reached my row, the ballroom had filled with the kind of polished faces that look friendly, until a scandal gives them permission to become sharp, and the lights above the stage made everything feel like it was meant to be seen. She leaned down beside me, not touching me, not daring to, and her voice came out low and controlled, as if control could rewrite what I had just witnessed in the lobby. She asked what I was doing here, and she said it like I was the one trespassing, like I had wandered into the wrong life by mistake, and I let her hang there in the discomfort for a beat longer than was polite. I told her I had a few questions, and I said it calmly, because calm is the most insulting thing you can give someone who expects anger. Her eyes moved to the folder on my lap, and I watched her swallow, because she recognized the shape of consequences even before she knew the details. She tried to pull me out of my seat, with a small gesture of her hand toward the doors, like this could still be handled privately, like privacy was a reward she deserved after she had taken mine. I did not stand, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not cause a scene, because I did not need to, since the room itself was already a stage that would amplify any crack in her mask. I asked her, in a voice just loud enough to make her lean closer, whether the committee session in our calendar was still happening, because I wanted her to choose a lie with witnesses nearby. She said yes, and she said it quickly, and the speed of it was the problem, because truth does not sprint. I asked whether the man in the lobby was part of that committee, and her face tightened in a way that made her look older, because she understood I was cutting through her story at the joints. She told me I was overreacting, and she told me she was networking, and she told me this was not what it looked like, and the repetition of it sounded like someone reading from a script they had rehearsed in the car. I listened without interrupting, because letting a liar talk is like letting them build a wall out of rotten wood, and when it collapses on them. I asked her one more time, quietly, whether she had eaten dinner on Tuesday, because I wanted her to repeat the details she had given me without realizing I had already preserved the contradiction. She hesitated again, and she said yes, she had eaten with the committee, and her eyes flicked away as if the room itself was accusing her, and I felt that cold certainty settle deeper in my chest. On stage, the event host tapped the microphone and began welcoming everyone, thanking donors, thanking volunteers, and congratulating the committee for their tireless work, and the words landed on me like bad comedy. My wife shifted on her feet, still hovering near my seat, still trying to find the angle that would make me fold, and I kept my posture neutral, as if I was listening to the speech like everyone else. She whispered that we would talk at home. She whispered that this was not the place, and her voice carried that faint edge of threat that people use when they are used to controlling the room. I glanced toward the badge table near the entrance, then back at her, and I saw her jaw tighten again, because she knew I had seen the badges, and she knew I had understood what the initial meant. The man from the lobby appeared at the edge of the aisle, scanning the room with that casual confidence, and when his eyes landed on my wife, he smiled like this was a normal date night. He approached, and he looked from her to me, and then back to her, and his smile faltered, because the situation was suddenly not arranged for his comfort. My wife stepped slightly in front of him like a shield, and in that small motion I saw the truth in her priorities, because she was protecting him first and managing me second. He asked her if everything was okay, and she answered too fast, and she said yes, just a misunderstanding, and the phrase came out so smooth that it sounded practiced, like she had used it before. I stood then, slowly, because sometimes you need to change the geometry of a moment to claim it. I did not point at him, and I did not shove him, and I did not do anything dramatic, because drama would let them both act like victims. I simply looked at him and asked, with the same steady tone, whether he had been the one in the hotel room the night I came with roses, because I wanted his face to register the danger of memory. He tried to laugh it off, the way men do when they think charm can erase facts. But the laugh died when he saw my expression, because I was not asking to start a fight, I was asking to finish a lie. My wife stepped closer and hissed that I was embarrassing her, and I almost smiled at the irony, because embarrassment was the currency she had been spending for months. I told her we could do this 2 ways, quietly or cleanly, and I said it with a softness that made her eyes widen, because she expected me to crack, not to organize. She insisted again that I was twisting things, that I was imagining the worst, that I had always been insecure. And as she spoke, I heard the faint echo of her voicemail from that other story in my head. The one where she had said too much because she assumed she was safe. I realized then that her real addiction was not the man beside her, but the feeling of being untouchable, because she had been rehearsing this denial as if denial were a permanent shield. I reached into the folder and pulled out a single page, not the whole stack, because one clean proof is more powerful than 1,000 angry words. I did not wave it around, and I did not announce it to the whole room, because I did not need to create chaos. I needed to create a record. I held the page between us, angled so only they could see it, and I asked her to explain the shared calendar block she had labeled as committee work, while the public event schedule clearly showed the reception happening at the same time. Her eyes dropped to the paper, and I watched her pupils tighten, because paper is the enemy of improvisation. She tried to claim the committee had moved the time, and I nodded as if that were possible. Then I pulled out my phone and showed her the exported week view PDF with the timestamp, and I let the silence do the work that shouting never can. Behind us, chairs scraped, and the nearby attendees shifted, because even when you try to keep something private in a crowd, humans can smell stress the way dogs smell fear. My wife looked around and realized a tension was forming, and I saw the calculation begin in her eyes, the part of her that always chose optics over honesty. She whispered that we would fix this later, and her voice cracked slightly on the word fix, because she knew she was not fixing anything, she was delaying impact. The man beside her began to back away, the way cowards retreat when consequences become physical in the sense of being undeniable, and I let him move, because his retreat was its own admission. The host on stage announced a short break before the committee recognition portion, and people stood up, drifting toward the bar tables and the doors, and suddenly the room became a moving maze of witnesses. My wife grabbed my arm then, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to signal ownership, and that touch was the last permission she was ever going to take from me. I looked down at her hand, then back up at her face, and I asked her to remove it, because I wanted her to understand the new rules without a fight. She released me, and for a second her composure slipped, revealing something frantic underneath, like a person realizing the ground has changed. She tried a different tactic, softer now, saying she had been lonely, saying I had been distant, saying she did not know how it got this far, and the sudden emotional pivot would have been convincing if I had not been watching her rehearse confidence all week. I told her I was not here to argue about feelings, and that I was here to talk about facts, and I said it slowly, because facts do not need speed. She accused me of setting her up, and the accusation would have been funny if it had not been so familiar, because people who lie always blame the person who notices. I asked her, in front of the moving crowd, to answer one simple question, which was whether she had called him babe in that hotel room, and her face went pale in a way that told me the word had not been mine, it had been hers. For a moment, she did not speak, and that silence was the loudest confession she had ever made. The man looked at her, then at me, then away, and I could see him searching for an exit that would not make him look guilty, but guilt was already painted on him by his hesitation. My wife finally whispered my name like it was a warning, and in that whisper I heard the end of our marriage more clearly than any shouting could have delivered. I did not answer with rage, because rage would have given her a story where she was harmed and I was unstable, and I refused to donate that narrative to her future. Instead, I did the only thing that mattered, which was to shift from private pain to public record without cruelty. I walked toward the board secretary's table near the side of the stage where folders and sign-in sheets were stacked, and I carried my folder like a man carrying ordinary paperwork. My wife followed, her steps quick, her breathing shallow, And I heard her telling me to stop, telling me not to do this, telling me she would explain, but explanation was not proof. I reached the table, nodded politely to the secretary, and asked where attendees could submit a written concern related to event conduct and committee integrity, because I wanted a process, not a tantrum. The secretary, surprised but professional, pointed to a small tray for documents, and in that instant, my wife froze, because she finally understood that I was not threatening her with embarrassment. I was walking her toward consequences that could not be argued with. I placed one sealed sleeve into the tray, not everything, just enough to trigger review, and I wrote today's date on the outside in plain ink. My wife stared at that sleeve like it was a weapon, and the man from the lobby stood several feet away now, suddenly very interested in the ceiling. The secretary thanked me and said the committee chair would be informed, and the sentence was boring, procedural, and lethal. My wife turned to me with a look that begged and blamed at the same time, and I met that look with the calm she feared most, because calm meant I was not improvising, and improvisation was her last hope. As the host called everyone back to their seats for recognition, I returned to my chair without hurrying, and I felt the room's mood shifting, the way air changes before a storm breaks. My wife remained standing in the aisle, caught between chasing me and saving face, and that hesitation told me the exposure had already started. I opened my folder one more time, not to add drama, but to check that the final piece was ready, and when I looked up, I saw her walking toward me with a forced smile that did not reach her eyes. I realized she had chosen the only move she had left, which was to sit beside me and pretend nothing was happening, and as she lowered herself into the chair, I understood that the next minutes would decide whether she left this room with dignity or with the full weight of her own timeline. By the time the host called everyone back to their seats, the room had that tight, polite hush that always shows up when people sense something is wrong, but do not yet have permission to stare, and my wife tried to slide into the chair beside me like she belonged there, like nothing had happened in the lobby, like I had not stood in a hotel hallway holding roses, while a barefoot man opened her door and I heard her voice call him babe. She angled her smile toward the nearest couple, she smoothed her dress, she placed her phone face down, and she breathed in a way that looked practiced, because she was not calming down, she was resetting her mask. I sat still, with my folder resting on my lap, and I watched her eyes keep jumping toward it, because in her mind it had turned into a bomb, but to me, it was only paper, and paper has a specific kind of cruelty, because it does not care how convincingly you perform. The host began reading names for committee recognition, thanking people for integrity and service, and the words sounded like a joke told too slowly. My wife clapped at the right moments, her palms barely touching, careful not to look distracted, and I let her perform, because the longer she performed, the more obvious it became when the performance broke. I felt the phone in my pocket vibrate once, a simple notification, and I did not check it, because I already had everything I needed, and checking it would have made me look eager. Instead, I leaned slightly toward my wife and asked, quietly and evenly, whether she was still going to tell me I was overreacting, now that I had placed the sealed sleeve into the submission tray and put today's date on it in front of the board secretary. She did not answer with words at first, because the answer would have created a new reality, and she was still trying to live in the old one. She told me, in a low voice that tried to sound like concern, that I was making a mistake, and she said the word mistake as if it belonged to me, not to her. She said I was ruining everything, and she meant her image, not our marriage, and that truth landed in my chest like a piece of ice that had been waiting there all along. I asked her what she had expected, because I wanted her to say it out loud, and she stared forward at the stage, jaw tight, as if looking at me would increase the damage. She said she expected me to talk to her privately, and I almost laughed at the timing, because privacy was what she had used as cover, and now she wanted it as mercy. I told her, still calm, that she had traded privacy for secrecy, and that secrecy always ends in public. The man from the lobby, the barefoot man who had become fully dressed now and had the nerve to hold a drink like he belonged here, moved along the side aisle and tried to avoid looking in our direction. That avoidance did more for me than any speech could, because shame is a language, and everyone reads it. My wife noticed him too, and I watched her shoulders stiffen, because she had been managing two audiences, and now both audiences were in the same room. She reached for my forearm under the table, not as affection, but as restraint, and I let her fingers touch fabric only, because I was done giving her access to my skin. I turned my wrist slightly so her hand slid off, and I did it slowly, so she understood it was a decision, not a reflex. On stage, the host announced the next segment would include a brief review of upcoming committee roles and a vote of confidence for next month's leadership positions, and the room stirred with that soft excitement people get when they think they are part of something important. My wife's eyes widened by a fraction, and she looked at me for the first time in minutes, because she suddenly understood the kind of arena this was becoming. She asked what I had put in the sleeve, and she asked like she was entitled to know, like betrayal came with a right to inspect the evidence. I told her the truth, which was that I had put enough to force someone else to ask questions, and that the rest would appear only if she kept pretending nothing happened. She whispered that I could not do this to her, and there it was again, that belief that consequences were something other people did, not something she earned. The board secretary stepped onto the stage with a clipboard, and the committee chair followed, smiling and shaking hands, and I watched my wife straighten her posture, because she knew these were people she needed. The chair spoke about transparency and standards, about avoiding conflicts of interest, about protecting the organization's reputation, and I could see my wife's throat move as she swallowed, because those words were no longer decoration. The chair announced that any concerns regarding conduct could be submitted through the official channel, and the secretary nodded toward the side table where the tray sat, and I felt my wife go rigid beside me, because she could see the path I had already walked. Then the chair added, almost casually, that one submission had already been received tonight and would be acknowledged after the vote, because the organization took integrity seriously. The room shifted, not into panic, but into attention, the way a crowd leans in when a story becomes live. My wife's breath caught, and she turned her head toward me again, her eyes sharp now, because she knew the submission was mine. She hissed that I was humiliating her, and the word humiliating almost made me smile, because humiliation had been her hobby until it became her consequence. I told her I was not humiliating her, and that I was refusing to carry her lie in my pocket, and I said it so evenly that she looked almost offended by the lack of emotion. People like her rely on emotion, because emotion can be blamed, but procedure cannot. The chair asked for a show of hands to approve the next month's leadership roster, and hands went up in a clean wave. My wife raised hers too, because habit is strong, and because she still believed she could outvote reality. The secretary counted, wrote, nodded, and the chair smiled like everything was normal, then turned toward the side table, and the secretary brought the tray up with a careful, practiced grip. It was a small moment, almost nothing, but it felt like the room's temperature dropped, because everyone could sense that the evening had acquired teeth. The chair thanked the person who had submitted the concern and said they would address it with care. Then, without naming me, they asked whether the submitting party was present and willing to confirm the submission for the record. I stood, not quickly, because quickness looks like guilt, and I did not want to look guilty. I felt my wife's eyes burn into my side, and I imagined her internal calculation, the one where she searched for the angle that would make her the victim and me the aggressor. I stepped into the aisle and raised my hand with a polite nod, and the chair looked relieved in that professional way, because they loved order even more than they loved truth. The chair asked me to approach the stage after the segment, and I nodded again, and the room's attention settled on me like a spotlight without light. My wife whispered my name, not in affection, but in warning, and I did not look back at her. because looking back would have invited her into my moment. Instead, I focused on the chair and the secretary, because those were the people holding the record, and the record was what mattered. I returned to my seat, and my wife leaned close, her voice trembling now despite her effort, and she told me I was destroying our life. I told her that our life was already destroyed, and that I was only stopping the damage from spreading into my future, and I watched her face tighten as if she had been slapped, because she was used to being the one who decided when reality began. The chair continued the program, trying to bring the room back to celebration, but celebration is fragile when doubt enters. People clapped again, people laughed on cue, but the laughter had that thin quality, because half of them were now watching my wife, and she could feel it. She had always been good at reading a room, which was why she had chosen this room as a place to perform, and now the same skill betrayed her because she could feel the shift, and she could not stop it. The man from the lobby moved farther back, trying to disappear, but disappearing is impossible when someone has already seen you in the doorway of a hotel room that was not yours. During the next break, the chair stepped down from the stage and spoke briefly with the secretary, and the secretary glanced toward me, then toward my wife, and then away, and that glance was enough to slice through my wife's last illusion of control. My wife stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a scrape that made a few heads turn, and she told me we were leaving, and she said it like an order. I remained seated, and I looked up at her calmly, and I told her she could leave, but I would stay, because the record needed me. She stared at me as if I had violated some rule, and in a way I had, because the rule in our marriage had been that she could behave however she wanted, and I would absorb it quietly. Then she leaned down and hissed that if I did this, she would make sure everyone knew I was unstable, and her eyes flicked toward a cluster of people she knew well, as if she already had the first chapter of her new story ready. That threat might have worked on a weaker night, on a night where I had come with roses and hope, but hope had died in a hallway, and all that remained was clarity. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, then placed it on the table between us, screen facing up, and I did not speak immediately, because silence makes people listen. Her face changed, quick and involuntary, because she recognized the posture of someone who had decided. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was letting her hear the truth she had already left behind, the truth she had accidentally recorded on a voicemail that she assumed would never matter. I tapped the screen once, and the audio began, and I did not need to raise the volume high because the table was close, and because her own name in her own voice has a specific power. Her recorded voice filled the small space between us, and even though the crowd noise around us was still present, I saw her react as if the room had gone silent. On the recording, she sounded relaxed, careless, confident, and she used the same pet name she had used in the hotel room, the same babe, the same soft laugh, the same tone that was not meant for a husband. She spoke as if I were a nuisance, as if I were an obstacle to manage, and she said something about me being predictable, about me overreacting, about how she could handle me with the right story and the right timing. The recording was not a confession of love, it was worse than that, because it was a confession of contempt. Her eyes went wide, then narrow, then wet, and for a second she looked like a person waking up in the wrong life. She reached for the phone, and I placed my hand over it, not aggressively, simply decisively, and I told her she could listen, and then she could choose. She whispered that I could not use that, and I told her I did not have to use anything, because she had already used herself, and all I was doing was refusing to unhear it. People nearby glanced over, not because they heard the audio clearly, but because they saw her expression, and expression is louder than sound. She tried to stand again, and she knocked her glass slightly, and the small clink drew more eyes. She leaned close and begged me, but the begging was tangled with anger because she was not begging for forgiveness, she was begging for control. I stopped the audio and slid the phone back toward my side of the table. Then I looked up at the board secretary as she approached with a neutral face. The secretary asked politely whether I was still willing to confirm my submission for the record, and I said yes, because yes is a complete sentence when you are done negotiating. The secretary invited me to a small side room near the stage, where committee documents were stored, and a few people followed at a distance, not officially, but socially, the way witnesses always gather when a story becomes unavoidable. My wife followed too, trying to keep her smile glued on, trying to look like a supportive spouse, but the smile was trembling now, and the tremble was what everyone noticed. In the side room, the chair sat at a folding table with the secretary, and another committee member stood near the doorway, arms crossed, looking like someone who hated conflict but loved policy. The chair thanked me for caring enough to submit a concern and asked me to summarize it briefly, and I did not summarize with drama, because drama is easy to dismiss. I opened my folder and placed one page on the table, then another, and I arranged them cleanly, because clean arrangements communicate reliability. I showed the exported shared calendar week view, the one where my wife had marked a committee session at the exact time the event had been advertised publicly, and I pointed to the overlap with a simple gesture, not a flourish. I showed a merchant alert from my own account, a charge tied to a hotel service that matched the date of her supposed committee work, and I kept the details minimal because the chair did not need intimacy, they needed timestamps. Then, as my wife began to speak, the chair raised a hand gently and asked her to wait, because procedure had entered the room, and procedure does not bend for charisma. My wife tried to explain, and her explanation was fast and full of emotional framing, and the chair's eyes drifted back to the paper because paper does not care about emotion. She claimed she was helping with donor outreach. She claimed she had taken a meeting off-site. She claimed she had been asked to keep something confidential, and each claim was a new branch in a tree that was already dying. I asked one question only, because one question is all you need when you have documents, and I asked her to confirm whether the barefoot man from the lobby was a vendor contact or a personal guest. She froze, and that freeze was the answer, and the committee member by the door shifted their weight, because even reluctant witnesses know what a freeze means. The chair asked whether I had any additional supporting material, and I nodded, then slid the phone forward, not to play the whole voicemail, but to show the timestamp and the contact label on the screen. I did not need to humiliate her with audio, because the existence of the file was enough to shift the room from doubt to action. The secretary took a photo of the screen for the record, then wrote a note, and I watched my wife's face as she realized the story was no longer in her mouth. It was in someone else's handwriting. The chair said calmly that the organization would open a compliance review and would temporarily suspend my wife from committee leadership pending review, because reputations were protected by acting quickly, and my wife looked as if she had been pushed into cold water. She tried to argue, and she tried to cry, and she tried to laugh it off, and each attempt made her look less stable, not because emotion is shameful, but because her emotion was aimed at avoiding consequence, not at owning truth. The chair repeated the decision with the same steady tone, then asked the secretary to note that evidence had been received and that a review was opened on record. The secretary typed the line into the minutes template, and the keyboard clicks sounded like a verdict. My wife turned to me and whispered that I was vindictive, and I told her I was precise, and there is a difference that people only understand when they are on the wrong side of it. We left the side room, and the hallway outside felt brighter, because the door had closed on the last version of her control. People who had been hovering nearby pretended not to stare, but their eyes followed us anyway, because humans cannot resist the gravity of a downfall. My wife's phone buzzed in her clutch, and she glanced at it, and her face tightened again, because messages were already arriving, the kind that sound supportive but feel like distance. She walked a step ahead of me, chin high, trying to reclaim posture, and I walked behind her with the folder held close, because I was not interested in looking victorious, I was interested in finishing cleanly. In the ballroom, the program continued, but the mood had shifted, and people spoke in smaller clusters now, voices lowered, names exchanged with raised eyebrows. The man from the lobby was gone, which meant he had fled as soon as the record began, and fleeing is its own testimony. My wife spotted his absence and looked briefly panicked. Then she covered it with a laugh toward a woman she knew, and the woman's smile did not match hers. I watched that interaction and felt a strange, calm emptiness, because I did not feel joy. I felt closure, and closure is quiet. My wife returned to our table and leaned toward me again, her voice rough now, and she asked what I wanted. That question would have mattered earlier, when I still believed wanting could change someone, but now wanting was irrelevant. I told her what I wanted was already happening, which was the end of her ability to rewrite me as the problem while she played the victim. I told her I would be filing for separation within the week, and that the evidence I had assembled would support the terms, and I said it plainly, because plain language removes hope of negotiation. She stared at me as if I had finally become someone else, and in a way I had, because the man who brought roses had died in a hallway, and the man in front of her had learned the cost of pretending. She whispered that I would regret it, and I asked her whether she regretted calling another man babe behind a door she thought I would never reach. She flinched, and the flinch was small, but it was real, and it was the only honest thing she had offered me all night. She tried one last time to sell me a softer story, something about a mistake, something about stress, something about me being absent, and I listened, because listening costs me nothing now. Then I stood, because standing ends conversations, and I gathered my folder and my phone, and I looked down at her with an expression that held no anger, because anger would have tied me to her, and I was done being tied. As I turned to leave the ballroom, the chair stepped back onto the stage and announced that committee leadership would be updated after review, and the statement was careful and professional and devastating, because it confirmed that something official had shifted. Heads turned not toward the chair, but toward my wife, because the room knew who the chair meant, and I watched my wife hold her smile like a cracked plate that could shatter at any touch. She looked at me then, eyes wide and furious and frightened all at once, and I realized she still believed she could punish me with her emotions, because she had never learned what happens when someone stops reacting. I walked toward the exit, and the doors opened with a soft push, and cold air from outside brushed my face, and it felt like the first clean breath I had taken in weeks. Behind me, I heard a ripple of conversation, the start of the story passing from mouth to mouth, each retelling stripping her of another layer of protection. I did not turn back, because turning back would have been a form of permission, and permission was the one thing I had finally stopped giving. I stepped into the lobby, and for a second I remembered the roses in my hand, the carpet beneath my shoes, the door opening, the barefoot man's surprise, and my wife's voice calling him babe like it was the most natural word in the world. Then I felt the phone in my pocket again, heavy and real, and I understood that the most brutal part of the night was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that she had believed I would carry it quietly forever, and as the ballroom doors closed behind me, I left her inside with the only thing she could not argue with, which was the timeline she had built with her own choices.